Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. This is the place for senior school leaders to discover innovative ideas and actionable tips that are going to help to strengthen their school's income streams and secure its future. My name's Juliette Corbett, and I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in independent schools. So thanks for joining me today, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to Series 2 of the Independent School Podcast. I was over the moon with the response that we had to Series 1, and I'm really excited to be back here with you now for Series 2. So in this series, we are going to be still focusing on strategic income generation for independent schools, but we're going to have a couple of small changes to the way that I'm doing things this time. So first of all, you're going to notice a little bit of a theme around bursaries and inclusion, and we're going to kick that off with next week's episode. But starting today, I want to mix it up a little bit with what I'm calling Spark episodes. So about once a month, I'm going to be covering a topic which is not specifically related to independent schools. I'll be talking to a guest and bringing in some best practice around a topic that's a bit more general beyond our sector, but in a way which is going to give you some really fresh new ideas to bring into your work. So this week, we're kicking off the Spark episodes by talking about innovation, and we're in the really excellent hands of Lucy Gower. So Lucy is the director and founder of Lucidity, and also the founder of the Lucidity Network. She's the author of the best-selling book, The Innovation Workout, and is a global speaker on innovation. So she's a coach, a trainer and facilitator, and she's given thousands of professionals all around the world the confidence and the tools to think more creatively, to develop their ideas and make their innovations actually happen. So I know Lucy really well. I'm a member of her Lucidity Network, which I find incredibly helpful for my own professional development. And I also facilitate the Lucidity Accelerator program alongside Lucy. The reason I wanted to talk about innovation is because in independent schools, we don't have innovation departments. We don't have professionals for whom innovation is the thing that they're passionate about, the only thing that they do. We often don't even have a budget for innovation, but it is imperative that independent schools are being innovative about the way that they're doing what they do. Now, this, of course, has been particularly the case during the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of examples of every single school having to innovate extremely quickly about getting a lot of what they do online in terms of the education they offer, but also in terms of their fundraising, their alumni relations. A lot of innovations had to happen in this last 12 months. But independent schools have been doing this for generations, even before we were calling it innovation. So any change that you're making at your school is driven by a process of innovation. So changing the way that parents drop off their children at the beginning of the day and the way that you're kind of managing the car park, changing the way that prep is being supervised in boarding houses, the way that particular elements of the curriculum are delivered. All of this involves a sense of innovation, and it's critically important for our business models and our sustainable business models as schools going forwards. We are innovative. So Lucy's an expert in innovation, and she brings a real best practice element to our work in this area. So we're talking about things like getting started and how to get people thinking more innovatively on your organisation, how to overcome a fear of failure, and sometimes that perfectionist culture that we see in schools can be really restricting innovation, so how to overcome that tension, how to innovate when budgets are really tight, and how to build a culture of innovation across your school. So lots of things useful for you as you strengthen your business models in independent schools. So let's dive into my interview with Lucy. So here we go. So hello, Lucy. Thank you for joining us on the Independent School Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So one of the things that I found when I talk to people about strategy is that, first of all, they don't really understand what it is when I talk about that term. And I feel it's the same often for innovation, that people don't always understand what we mean by innovation when we talk about it. So when you're working with organisations that aren't familiar with that terminology around innovation, how do you describe what innovation actually is?
Yes, that's such a good question. I think innovation is a bit of a buzzword and it means something different to everybody. So, how I tend to talk about it is what you do differently in order to achieve your mission. And within that, there's a couple of words that are really important. So, differently. So, if it's different for you, that counts as innovation, even if other people have been doing it for years. One of the things I say around innovation, it's not about being utterly brand new in the world. Steal with glee. If you see another organisation doing something that could work for you, then have a go and make it work in your context. And then the second word that's important is around achieving your mission. So it's your mission. The innovation needs to have a purpose. If it doesn't get you closer to achieving your mission, then you're just innovating for the sake of it. And I don't recommend you do it. And within that, I think there's two different ways you can approach innovation. So one would be incremental innovation. So that's the sum of all the small changes that every single person can make. All those 1% little tweaks to processes, systems, products that can add up to make a really big difference. And I think that's part of everybody's role in an organisation, to be looking almost restlessly to, is there a better way? Is there a better way that we can do it? And then the other type of innovation that gets talked about is radical or disruptive innovation, which is around completely changing how things are done, completely changing, for example, the way that you fundraise. I see less of that because it's more risky, costs more budget, can take longer. And the example that maybe I'd use to illustrate it would be Airbnb, so the biggest provider of accommodation on the planet, but they don't own any properties. They've completely changed the hotel and accommodation industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes people get a little bit stuck with the idea that they're not innovative and creative because they haven't come up with these brand new, massively disruptive, radical innovations. Whereas in actual fact, for most people, for most of the time, it is that incremental innovation, which is actually part of our day-to-day role. And it's only occasionally that we get this flash of inspiration as to how we can massively change something. And obviously acting on that can be really important when that inspiration hits. But most of the time it's finding those small improvements that you can make over time. And as you say, it reduces the risk as well.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that I find is that innovation is that buzzword, perhaps similar to strategy. People think that they're not innovative or they're not creative. And as human beings, we are absolutely creative and innovative. It's about our ability to solve problems and make connections between unconnected things to come up with something new. And that sits in all of our gift. It's not about being able to draw. It's how our creativity manifests itself is different for all of us. Some of us might be amazing at making fundraising bids, or great at speaking with donors, or great singers, dancers, excellent at spreadsheets. Our creativity is different for all of us, but fundamentally, human beings are wired to solve problems and to be creative. So the biggest challenge I often find when I work with teams is that people don't believe that they can do it, or believe that it's not their role or their place to come up with suggestions and different ways of working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often find that with strategy as well, that people feel, oh, I'm not strategic, it's not my role. And it's the same with creativity. I think sometimes we think artistry is the only form of creativity, but actually there's a lot of creative things you can do with a spreadsheet and with data and with, a class of pupils in front of you that isn't going to use your artistry skills, but is still going to be incredibly innovative and creative in the way that you're achieving your goals. And coming back to that idea of it connecting to your mission, this kind of leads to the connection between innovation and strategy. And so the first thing that you have to do when you're thinking about how to build innovation into the culture of a school is thinking about how it fits into achieving your goal, your mission, your vision, your strategy, whatever you want to call it. It's thinking about what you're trying to achieve and then thinking about what needs to change to get there. And that's where the innovation comes in.
Absolutely. And knowing your purpose, like why are you innovating, is so important, because if you've ever tried to change anything or make any sort of change, especially within an organisation, it can be difficult. It can be tricky. Not everybody wants to make the changes. that you want to make. So your why, your reason for making changes, has to be way more compelling than all the reasons why not. Because if your why isn't compelling enough, then it's very difficult to make any change happen or get anything new off the ground.
Yeah, definitely. And people can connect that to their personal purpose and why, kind of, what drew them to that career, what drew them to that organisation, as well as to the overall organisational why. So for a school, educating pupils in the most excellent and innovative and inspirational way possible is your organisational why, but you will also have a personal purpose, a personal why. And so helping people to understand how change and innovation can help them achieve that personal connection to what they're doing and why they're doing it is one of the ways to overcome that resistance to change that we all often experience in organisations.
Absolutely. And a lot of the work that I do with teams is helping them to align that why. And I use storytelling a lot to help people to tell their story about why they're doing what they're doing. And often in an organisation, you'll find a common thread that runs through everybody's stories, that they might be passionate about helping people learn, or passionate about giving people the same opportunities that they had when they were younger. It varies for different organisations, but everybody aligning behind why what they're doing is important is a really important part of any innovation strategy.
Yeah, definitely. Often I think one of the hardest steps is the first step. So if we're talking to leaders in independent schools and they want to get started on helping their team or their whole school to become more innovative in what they're doing, what's the kind of activities that you recommend they start with? How do you get the ball rolling?
That's such a good question. I think, first of all, it's that piece around why, and getting people to share their why, their story. Why do they do what they do? Why do they get out of bed in the morning to come and work here, and start to share some of those stories? That would be the first thing. And as a leader, I'm sure that you will have heard this before, it's about leading by example. So your story about why you're passionate about what you're doing, and therefore why it's important to have that restless curiosity to find the very best way to do it, will motivate and inspire others to get on board with making change happen. I think the other thing is to acknowledge that change can be difficult and people can be in a different place with it. So you might be really excited about the new idea that you've had, but don't expect anyone else to be. There's work to do in order to bring people on board, and that can take more time and energy, but you're almost setting the foundations in place that you need to create a culture where innovation can happen. And it's leading by example with some of those behaviours around sharing and learning from failure, about allowing people to muse and reflect and to have time to think creatively and be innovative. Sometimes it's very difficult if an organisational culture is being very busy. We're busy, we've got a lot to do, we've got a lot of things we want to achieve. And giving permission and allowing people and encouraging people and leading by example to step back, to think about the bigger picture, and to allow enough time to say, okay, how might we do this differently? How might we be able to deliver more for our school if we approach this in a different way? Are there problems that we can overcome? Can we think creatively about this? And that takes time.
Yeah, and I often find that people feel fear that if they're seen to be just sitting thinking, whether that's at their desk or taking a walk at lunchtime, that people think they're not working. But actually, especially as you move up into senior leadership roles, time to think is the fuel that you need to actually be doing a really, really good job at what you're doing. So whether that's thinking about change and innovation and creatively thinking about new ideas, whether that's thinking strategically about pulling together different strands of things that are happening across your school, looking for patterns, looking for things that are working, looking for new opportunities for leverage and collaboration and so on. Whatever it is, that time to think and giving people permission to take time to think is something that if you role model it from the top can be really fuel to the fires of having change in your organisation.
Absolutely. And I think that you hit the nail on the head with that reframing of it's the fuel for your creativity, for your productivity, for your smarter thinking by being able to take time out. So some of the things that I encourage my clients to do is to walk and take a notebook and write things down as they're going along, to have walk and talk meetings where your blood's going around your body to your brain, where there's research that shows that you can be more creative when you're moving about, especially when we're working from home. I think the other thing is that creativity is around being able to put ideas together in new ways. There's a book I'd recommend by an author called Stephen Johnson called Where Good Ideas Come From. And he talks about creativity and therefore innovation, which is doing the actions that come out of your creativity. He talks about it in terms of making connections between unconnected things and being able to put them back together in a new way. And you have to have curiosity and experience in order to bring those ideas together in a different way. And that means you looking outside of your day-to-day job for inspiration and other things that you can bring back in. And that takes time. So leading by example, getting away from that feeling of you need to be at your desk doing work in order to be able to be working, and that the reframe that time to think is fuel is tough to do. It sounds really easy. It's really difficult to do. That's where the nuggets of genius are, when people have time to put those different connections together.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. The nuggets of genius. Brilliant. And it is that restless curiosity that you mentioned earlier, isn't it? It's the constantly kind of saying, well, why? You turn into a toddler. Why do we do it this way? And kind of constantly questioning whether or not there are better ways to do things. And I love that you've mentioned there, taking the opportunity to explore and be curious beyond your core industry, your core kind of sector. And that's why I'm doing these episodes in this podcast, these Spark episodes, is to give people a point of view that's from outside the school sector. I think that ties back to what we were talking about back at the beginning of this episode as well, that if the pressure's on for you to create something so innovative it's never been done before, you're setting yourself a really high bar for that level of creativity and innovation. In actual fact, most people who we think of as innovative and creative, what they're doing is they're constantly exposing themselves to new ideas from outside their core sector, and then bringing those ideas back into their professional role in their job. And then that's what has this impact of changing a particular sector, because you're bringing in new ideas from outside. So you gave the example of Airbnb. They didn't create that technology from scratch. They took ideas they were seeing from elsewhere and implemented them into the accommodation industry. And so it's actually, the bar is lower than you think. It's not difficult to do this. It's not difficult to think creatively and be innovative. The challenge is carving out the time and then being restlessly curious about all those other opportunities out there, and then constantly being a bit of a toddler about saying, well, why can't we use that? Why do we do it this way? Why can't we take this idea from something else we've seen and see how it goes?
Exactly. That restless curiosity is one of my favourite expressions when it comes to innovation. And to go back to the Airbnb example, fundamentally, the problem that they were solving is they didn't have any money. And they thought, well, what if we got some blow up mattresses and we put them on our lounge floor and we rented them out for people who needed cheap accommodation? That was the starting point for it. Many years before it was successful. So there was a lot of failures along the way that often we don't get to hear about, and we only see the bright, sparkly, successful thing, which is rarely the first idea or the first iteration of something.
Yeah, which brings us on to this idea of failure and acceptance of risk-taking. So I've worked with independent schools for many, many, many years, and I'm not doing a disservice, I don't think, to the sector, but to say that generally speaking, independent schools have quite a perfectionist culture. They want to do everything absolutely at the top of their game, and it has to be perfect. And there's nothing wrong with that generally. It's fine to have that kind of approach, that kind of culture, except in the way that it restricts innovation and it prevents people from taking risk, because there's a very low tolerance of failure within that kind of perfectionist culture. So Do you see this quite often, Lucy? And how do you recommend organisations balance this idea of being innovative and open to failure with the idea that things also have to be really excellent and that kind of perfectionist culture?
Such a good question. The perfectionist culture is a real challenge for innovation, because your first idea or your first iteration of your idea is really unlikely to work. It's much more likely to fail than it is to work and be really successful. And so getting away from it has to be perfect first time to a mindset of I need to test and learn and test and learn, and that's what will make it perfect, is a really big shift and can feel extremely uncomfortable. I think that there's a few things to think about in terms of failure. I do a lot of work with teams around building a culture where it is okay to fail and to learn, in the restless curiosity to seek perfection. Sometimes some organizations don't talk about failure. They talk about a glitch, which is something that can be put right, whereas the language of a failure sounds like it's almost like a fait accompli. That was a failure and we're going to put it to one side. It's around looking at your process to get to perfection as testing and learning. I would say to a lot of teams, you can't have a failed test. If you reframe something as a test, you found out whether something works or not, and that can take some of the pressure off. And I think that if there's a culture around perfection, it's really hard to reach perfection if you're not testing with your audiences and making those small 1% changes. I kind of don't believe that anything is ever perfect. There's always room for improvement when the world is changing. The world's not static, and therefore everything we're doing, the thing that is perfect at this exact point in time, won't be perfect in a month, a week, a year from now.
Yeah, I love that idea. I love the idea that you can aim for perfection. You know, that's great. You've got high standards, you've got high expectations, you've got real ambition in terms of what you're trying to achieve as a school. That's really to be lauded. That's fantastic. But to acknowledge that in a changing environment, we have to constantly work towards that perfection. And so I love the way of reframing things rather than trying it and then it fails. If you test it, you're always going to learn something from it.
Exactly. And the way to reduce that risk or that feeling of risk, because often risk is something that is personal to us. We'll all have a different capacity for taking risk. And one of the things that I help teams with a lot is around failure and risk and why we feel in the way that we do. And one of the things that we talk about is that we are programmed for survival. So we're programmed to think if we do something new, there's more risk of that failing than continuing as we are, even though we know what we're currently doing isn't delivering the results that we want to deliver. And it comes back from many, many years ago when we perhaps live in caves or small communities, and we'd have a choice. We could go and see what was over the hill and see if there was a better life that we could live, or we could stay where we were. And we are programmed, if we are safe, that we will stay where we are, or if we feel safe, we'll stay where we are because we think the risk of something worse being out there is greater than the risk of something better being out there. So that may have been helpful when we lived in caves and small communities. It's less helpful if you are leading an independent school and you know that you need to make changes in order to be able to deliver more for your mission, and you're programmed to stay as you are, because fundamentally that's a good thing because it's coming from a place of keeping people safe. So I think that when we're struggling with risk and failure, it's helpful to remember why we're feeling that. And that if people don't want to change with you, if you're the person that's trying to drive the change, remember that they are programmed to stay safe. So helping them take really small steps to manage that risk and learn from it and then take the next step, it is a way of being able to take people with you and to manage the risk together and to acknowledge that it can feel really scary to do something new.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that explains why some of those early days of the pandemic did feel so unsettling, was because we were pushed beyond, we were made to realise that the status quo was no longer the safe option, and therefore we're pushed to try new things and innovate and think outside the box.
Absolutely. And earlier I talked about incremental innovation and radical innovation. And that was really in the context of we are choosing to do it. We can choose to disrupt the way that our school works, for example. What happened with the pandemic, it was done to us. We were forced to change radically. And that can feel very different to having to do something than making a choice to do it, which can make us feel even more uncomfortable and anxious than if we feel in control of the situation.
Definitely. And the reflection from that is that if you're leading a team or the school, it may feel to others that you are forcing change upon them, and therefore involving people as much as possible is a way to reduce that anxiety and to get people involved and feeling like they have some control over ideas and opportunities to move forward and innovate in their own teams.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the other things that I think hold people back a little bit from the idea of innovation is the thought that it's going to take a lot of money. Generally speaking, we're looking at a time when people are cutting budgets and trying to scale back on costs. And yet this is a time when innovation is actually more important than ever, because we do need to make some fundamental shifts to the new environment that we're coming through, both the temporary environment during the pandemic and the new environment that's emerging post-pandemic. Do you have any advice on innovating on a tight budget or potentially no budget at all?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think there's maybe a myth around needing to have a team that does innovation specifically or a budget for innovation in order to be successful at it. I don't believe that is the case. I think that I'm seeing a lot of organisations with no budget being really resourceful about how they do things differently, working with volunteers, using new technology that can automate a lot of things, for example. And I think that the things that I'd say around innovating with no budget is, again, back to your why, back to your purpose. Why is it important? And what's the cost of not doing it? We often think about the risk of changing something. What's the risk of staying as you are when the world is changing? I think it's around prioritizing. You can't innovate about absolutely everything, but prioritizing some areas that if you innovate around them could make the most impact or difference. And then it's back to acting like a toddler and that incremental innovation. I don't believe that you need an innovation budget or an innovation team to be really excellent at innovation. It's bringing people with you, and when innovation is part of everybody's role, so everyone is charged with and has permission to spot where something isn't working and then ask the questions. There are, in every organisation I've worked with, there's so many different tiny little shifts that can make a big difference. So let me give you a story to explain what I mean by all these little nuggets of genius hiding in your organisation. So when I used to work at the NSPCC, the big children's charity, and I worked within innovation there, one of the things we tried to do was to put people in different teams, connect people across different teams. And we were good at seconding people into different roles to increase their experience of the organisation. And one of the outputs of that was that people had their toddler syndrome and could spot where things didn't quite work. So one person was seconded into the supporter care team. So that's the team that takes phone calls from supporters. Often they'll take phone calls where people would want to upgrade their monthly gift. So say from £3 a month to £5 a month. And they noticed that it took over a month for that donation to be active in the NSPCC bank account. So they asked why. Well, why does it take so long? And it turned out that when the system was originally set up some years previously, that's how it had to work. But banking had changed. And actually, it was now possible for when that call was made, the upgrade was made, that money went into the bank straight away, which in that first year equated to £150,000 of additional income for the NSPCC. It's not about the money per se, but that money could then be used for services in order that we could protect and help more young people. Because she was new and she was learning a system, she had a different perspective and could ask lots of questions. And I believe that every organisation has lots of those within it, if only we're given permission and are brave enough and tasked with that restless curiosity to spot it. That cost no budget, but resulted in a huge impact on the lives of the children that we existed to protect.
And that story brings in so much of what we've been talking about. So someone coming in new, seeing things afresh from a different section, someone asking why, the fact that that system had been perfect when it was designed all those years ago, but actually because banking had moved on, it was no longer the perfect system. So it picks up on lots of the things we've been talking about earlier in this episode. That's fantastic. So what we're talking about here is it's basically having a culture of innovation, isn't it? You're talking about having a culture where everybody can see this as part of their role. Do you have any tips on how to build that culture of innovation?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I do feel a bit like a stuck record, and I'm going to say, make sure everybody is lined behind why they're doing what they're doing and what their purpose is. So it's like that story about the person who was cleaning at NASA and JFK said to them, "What do you do?" And they said, "I'm here to put a man on the moon." It's that thread that runs through everybody's work, regardless of what their role is or their seniority is. There's something really important about leadership and leading by example and being a role model in terms of leaders sharing their failures, sharing their learning from their failures, allowing time for people to reflect, to ponder, to think, to be creative. And deliberately, I think, creating opportunities for different teams to meet. So whether that's a secondment program, whether that's within your induction programs that people are introduced to different teams to stop any sort of silo working where people start to all think in the same way, and being deliberate about involving your customers, the people who benefit from the work that you do, to be involved in that too. Because one of the things that can happen really easily when we're striving to be good at innovation is we lose sight of the problems we're solving and who we're solving them for. So asking your students, your parents, whoever your audiences are, about the problems that they have and how you can solve them might help to direct some of the innovation focus and involve people from across the organisation in coming up with those solutions. And that needs some sort of, what gets measured gets done. So what do your goals or KPIs, key performance indicators or objectives look like around that? So it's really easy to talk about creating a culture where it's okay to fail and make people feel safe. But unless you're measuring that in some way, you have a big gap between knowing and doing. So do people have objectives around what have you learned? What have you tested and learned? What new area have you learned about and what can you bring back to the organisation? Having objectives around helping other teams or helping other departments. And how can you facilitate conversations that help people to focus on their purpose, the purpose of the organisation, and solving problems in order that you can achieve your mission quicker, more effectively, and in an ideal world with less budget.
Yes, absolutely. And quite a lot of that has become more challenging with more working from home. People, even if they're working in the school still, but being more remote from each other in terms of not sitting next to each other at lunch and having that conversation, which may seem like it's just a very social chat over lunch. Actually, it sparks ideas, it sparks collaboration. And that cross-fertilization of ideas across the whole school. I know I've talked to a lot of people recently who've said that that's just not happening at the moment, and it's finding ways to build that back in to our day-to-day activities. And as you say, it's about role modelling all of these things from the top. And so thinking as a leader within your school, what behaviors am I looking for? What kind of things do I want people to be doing? Okay, coming up with new ideas, making changes, testing things. That's great. So then thinking about how do I role model that? And then, as you say, what gets measured gets done. So thinking about whether there's a question in annual review processes, KPIs, etc., it's going to be qualitative rather than quantitative, but asking people to actually reflect on, okay, so what have you changed this year? What systems have you changed? What ideas have you tried? What did you learn? And encouraging that restless curiosity we were talking about in that way can be really helpful.
Absolutely. And that can create a bit of a virtuous circle, because once people reflect, they realise, oh, I am creative. I'm doing this already. I just hadn't labelled it as that, which can help to build confidence, which then can help to continue that behaviour. But often we're so busy, we don't take that time, or we're just not able to take that time to reflect and realise, wow, we have done a lot after all, and we have made changes.
Absolutely. And that goes for us personally as well as teams, to actually reflect on the things that you have changed and the ways that you have moved on. It's really important to get that positive feedback. So, Lucy, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about how you work with not-for-profits, and also a little bit more about the Lucidity Network that you run as well.
Yes, so thank you. So I work with individuals, teams and whole organisations to help them to think differently, to unleash their creativity, but more importantly, to give them the courage and bravery and next steps to do something about it. So to innovate. So I coach and I train and I facilitate workshops in order to help organisations to think differently and make more impact. The Lucidity Network is a membership network that I run that was born out of me spotting the same challenges coming up for all of my clients, often around dips in confidence. When you're trying to do something new and you're getting pushback, your confidence can take a real knock. And also what I noticed was that people weren't particularly well connected outside of their own area that they knew about. So if we've talked about creativity is about making connections and joining different perspectives in a new way, if you're not networked outside of your sector and outside of what you know, that's quite difficult. So the network is a combination of training, coaching and support to help people to think differently, make change happen, and we have fun at the same time as well. It's a very supportive network. And if you're interested in joining, I'm sure I can send you a link.
Yes, we'll put the link in the episode notes for this, definitely. So I'm a member of the Lucidity Network, have been for almost a year, and I love it. It's a fantastic combination of, as you say, having fun, which is with some really lovely, really nice, interesting people, but also to be sharing that curiosity for the world. So looking to be networked outside our own sectors and looking to explore ideas together, which then spark all sorts of ideas, all sorts of conversations, and then innovation and creativity come from that. So I highly recommend it for anyone who's looking to invest in their own professional development. Thank you so much, Lucy. We have covered so many nuggets of genius today, I feel. Just to recap, I think bring the bar lower. We're not looking for something which is new to the entire world. Plug yourself into networks beyond the independent schools sector. And then, as Lucy said at the beginning, steal with glee. Take the opportunity to see what's working elsewhere and continually ask why we can't do it that way in our schools. Give yourself and your team permission to take time to think. It's so important to have time to think. And sharing your why with each other, that's actually something I do a lot in the workshops that I run. And it's an incredibly powerful exercise to share with your team what your purpose is, why you're there, and what your personal connection to the school's vision and mission is. Rephrase those failures as glitches and just look for those nuggets of genius. I think there's so much that we've learned here, Lucy, so thank you so much. I'm also going to put a link in the episode notes, both to Lucy's book, The Innovation Workout, which is well worth the read, and also to Where Good Ideas Come From by Steve Johnson, which I've also read, which is really also easy to read and a good way of introducing yourself to more information about innovation. So thank you so much, Lucy, for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
It has. So that's it for today, and thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast. If you want to make sure that you don't miss out on future episodes, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. There you can also explore the various ways that I help independent schools to strengthen their income streams and secure their future. Fantastic. See you next time then. Cast.